Well, literally, public art is anything that isn't private art, and that includes art in galleries, which are public spaces. More often than not, people's perception of public art is actually percent for art, and quite often fixed permanent public sculpture as the traditional first forms that percent for art came about in. But that's a much broader term now, and encompasses a huge amount of practice. But I really don't get hung up on what the words mean, and it doesn't really bother me so much. Just with the exception of that percent for art, as opposed to sort of public art. Percent for art is just simply a funding mechanism that arises out of capital development. It's not to do with public art really, or to do with art really. It's a simple funding mechanism. One of the big shifts in public art practice and in percent for art commissioning is around diversification of approaches to commissioning, and also you're seeing an awful lot more of other art forms other than visual art being involved, and in visual art an awful lot of other approaches other than fixed permanent public sculpture. But that's an evolution that has been going on for quite some time, and to some, in some respects, is an awful lot is quite healthy and is actually happening quite rapidly, even though it wouldn't seem so. In the process I was involved in revising the guidelines, a part of that would have been researching public art practice and percent for art commissioning in other countries. And I was quite surprised to see how practices in the UK and Europe and the US really hadn't progressed very far. To a large extent, the commissioning is still around fixed permanent public sculpture for an aesthetic value of enhancing public spaces, where percent for art was actually quite some years ago in Ireland, but has changed. In other places it hasn't changed at all. So we're not in a bad place. We're just sort of like continuing on that journey, so to speak. The nature of percent for art, and it's one of the unique things about it, is that it is linked to capital development. It's the beauty of it in some respects, insofar as the argument of, well, why were you spending money on art when you're not spending money on hospitals and schools and so on. With percent for art, you are, if you're spending money on hospitals and schools, when you're spending money on art as well. If you're not spending on the other things, you don't spend it on art, it happens on par. So that argument is redundant, and it's a great asset to have with that scheme. Obviously, in these times, there's very little capital development going to be happening. Very few roads, very few, and so on. So there's going to be very few percent for art schemes for this period. And that's a fact. There's nothing much you can do about that. But when the opportunity arises again, well, the opportunity will arise again for percent for art. Being optimistic, because it will be a much reduced level of activity, there'll be greater time to spend on the projects that are going on. So they'll probably be better researched, more time spent on them. So you could try and sort of pull out or eke out some positives out of that downturn. Nothing is particularly as simple or as easy as it might seem at the end of the day, from any theatre production to any road you see built or any sort of garden you see managed. Obviously there's an awful lot more sweat and effort and time and debates go into these things that are behind the scenes. Particularly with a lot of art projects, there's an awful lot of groundwork would have happened long before the project would have started proper, so to speak, and that's an ongoing thing. But it's not to say that it's any more or less difficult than any other area as such. I think local authority arts officers play sort of numerous roles, as well as sort of facilitating projects and developing new audience and so on. There's an ambassadorial role that somewhat you're sort of trying to encourage the role of art being more integrated into the body of the local authority on an ongoing basis, and they're sort of doing that to some extent in the wider community as well, through every project and every opportunity that emerges. Well, there's a number of projects that we have gone on in that really excite me, and sort of because they excite me, I think they should excite everybody else. Like, you know, we've just had trade last weekend, and the work of the likes of Darren Ammond or the last trade program with Alfredo Jar, like, you know, there's just insights that people have there that I think everybody would really get a huge kick out of and would learn a lot from. Like, there's nobody in this wide world couldn't think that that work wasn't brilliant. Art at Work, the residency program in workspaces or places in County Roscommon, always turns out amazing results, not in terms of like the actual work, which often is brilliant, but in the attitudes that people come out with, like, you know, both from the artist's perspective and from the staff and management in the company, like, you know, almost inevitably, you know, thought that was brilliant, and they were really sort of like got a huge insight into looking at things differently in that. And I think more of those opportunities that people get a chance to engage in is the better. I really love art, and I love what it does, and I love what it gives to people. And to me, the fact that there are loads of people who don't get that or don't see it's for them or whatever is sort of a big shame. So I think a lot of what I try to do is to sort of try and widen that field so that everybody can engage with it a little bit better, or at least for the first time, to give it a shot.